If you have a Bible and you find it helpful, please turn it to the 18th chapter of Luke. This is where we'll be spending our time. Do you know we've been in Luke for 92 weeks? When we read our Bibles, or we're taught something, or we pick up a daily bread, or we pick up something that's got some kind of declaration on it about God, a declaration about how then we should live. And by the way, if it's warm in here to anybody, these fans can be turned on. I just didn't turn them on. That bottom switch over there turns them on the left, on my left. So if anybody gets warm, feel free to hop up and turn those fans on. We tend, and all of us do this, I do this, we all tend to take whatever we read in Scripture regarding who God is, what He's doing, who Jesus is, what He's doing, what the New Testament expects of us. We all read it and we pull from it the things that we want to hear, to one degree or another, some less, some more. Now, I'm not going to get into any comparisons like that, but you know, we talked about in Sunday school this morning the idea of idolatry. And it's one of the most serious things that God speaks to us about throughout the Old Testament. I think we should think about that a little bit. But think for a moment what it means if we take our New Testament and we read of Jesus and we craft a Jesus that looks more like what we desire Him to look like than the way He really looks. And we all do that to some degree or another. I'm not wanting anybody to feel bad. I'm just saying this is how we are as human beings. We all craft a Jesus that looks more like what we would like Him to look like, perhaps, than He really is. Let's take a look at the text. It's very short. I'll begin reading in verse 31 of chapter 18. Jesus took the 12 aside, and He said, we're going up to Jerusalem, and everything written in the prophets about the Son of Man will be fulfilled. He'll be handed over to the authorities, to the Gentiles. They'll mock Him, insult Him, spit on Him, scourge Him, and kill Him. And on the third day, He will rise again. The disciples didn't understand any of this. Its meaning was hidden from them, and they didn't know what Jesus was talking about. The disciples are good Jewish boys and girls, and they're hearing every word of this through their Jewish matrix. They don't understand it fully. They're interpreting from an historical Jewish perspective. You know, I've heard people say things about this text, and I'm sorry for anybody who thinks this way. They will say things about this text and speak disparagingly of the Jewish people on the basis of it. I'm not one of those. I mean, without Judaism, there is no Christianity. So we need to keep that in mind. Salvation comes from the Jews. But these guys are listening to Jesus, and they're just totally befuddled by this. They don't have any idea what He's talking about. And this is not the first time that Jesus has said this. You go back in Luke 9, He did the same thing before. And I look at it and I think to myself, I've got the glorified hindsight of the New Testament, you see, so I know what's coming. And I think to myself, Jesus knows what's coming. But He just keeps walking forward toward it. He's on His way to Jerusalem. These are the last days of His life prior to Passover. And He's on His way to Jerusalem. The disciples don't have any idea what's coming. But you've got the whole trajectory of the gospel given in this little saying that Jesus gives to His disciples. What's the gospel? We just read the whole thing. The whole thing is right there. And they didn't understand it. Now, Jesus uses a very specific title. And by the way, this title for Jesus, the Son of Man, is it's His favorite title. It's the one He uses more than any other throughout the Scriptures, the New Testament, regarding Himself. We take this text to say, well, the Son of Man, it's talking about His humanity, because throughout the Old Testament, in many instances, that's exactly what it means. Ezekiel talks about the Son of Man. God addresses Ezekiel and says, "Oh, Son of Man." And you think, well, that's Ezekiel. He's a guy like the rest of humanity. God's addressing him. That's not at all what this means. This comes straight out of Daniel chapter 7, and it's a title of deity. It's not talking about Jesus' humanity. It's talking about His deity. This is Jesus saying of Himself, you're not aware of who I really am. I'm the Son of Man. And he uses it the first time we see it in his healing of the lame man in Capernaum is the first place we hear this title applied to himself. Well, why are they confused? Why are the Jewish boys and girls confused here when Jesus says this? Well, it's because they're looking for the big conqueror. They're looking for the Jesus who's going to come, Son of David, going to blast through the Roman Empire, blast through all of Rome, blast into Jerusalem, and blast everybody out of the way and leave Jerusalem as the navel of the world once again. And God having his own king on that throne. And if I were one of these Jewish guys, that's exactly how I'd be looking at it. But that's not at all how it's supposed to be. You know, it is fascinating to me, and I think this is worth thinking about. We read this about them, and they don't understand. All right? How many times have you had an opportunity to talk to somebody about the gospel we do have, and they don't understand or believe? So why should we be shocked? I mean, really. Jesus walked all over the place, and people saw him raise the dead and do all sorts of things, and they didn't believe. So why should we be shocked if we talk to somebody about the gospel of Jesus and they walk away from us unbelieving? Now I want to continue with the text. We're going to start in verse 35 because there's more to it than this. As Jesus approached Jericho, a blind man was sitting by the roadside begging. When he heard the crowd going by, he asked the crowd, "What's happening?" They told him, "Jesus of Nazareth is passing by." He called out immediately, "Son of David, Jesus, have mercy on me." Well, those who were there along the way rebuked him and told him to be quiet. But he called out all the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stopped and ordered the man to be brought to him. When he came near, Jesus asked the man, "What do you want me to do for you?" "Lord, I want to see," he said. Jesus said, "Receive your sight. Your faith has made you well." Immediately, the man received his sight. He followed Jesus, praising God. And when all the people saw it, they also praised God. Okay. This, if you go and look in Mark chapter 10, this is Bartimaeus. Luke doesn't give him a name, but Mark does. And what I find incredible about this is here's a blind guy. Now he's blind. I guess he's been blind from birth. It doesn't say. I'm assuming that. But even so, he knows something about Jesus here that is really important. He gives Jesus the very title of Messiah that the Jews would give to Jesus, Son of David. He knows who Jesus is. How does he know that? I don't know. That's straight out of the prophets. Ezekiel chapter 37, the Son of David is going to sit on the throne. So what's he doing there? Well, in this time in history, there's not a lot going on. They don't have a movie theater. They don't have big screen TVs. They don't have football games. They don't have things. Well, they did have the stadium in a way, but they don't have a lot going on. And so when anybody would hear that a group was coming through town, just a group, whatever they are. Here's a group following Jesus. Well, the followers of Jesus are coming through town. Everybody will go out to the roadside and gather on the sides of the road and meet them as they come through town, just out of pure curiosity to see what's going on. Kind of like us when we drive past a wreck. Everybody's got to slow down to 3 miles an hour so that they can spend all the time possible looking at the wreck. Since they want to go slow, they're not looking at the road anymore, and they don't want to have a wreck themselves. Well, this is kind of what was going on. Well, on this particular day, this blind man sees way more than most of the people who were gathered there that day. Somehow, supernaturally, he knows that this is the Son of David in that Jewish sense of being the Messiah. Think about his day. If you knew something of a blind person in the first century, what would they do? Well, they'd wake up in the morning and they can't see anything, so waking up is no different than being asleep, other than you're just asleep. You don't see anything. You get up, you find your clothing, whatever that clothing is. You kind of shake. They slept on straw mats, so you probably got some straw caught in your hair. You want to shake some of that out. You get up, you take a stick, your tapping stick, and you start to tap your way through whatever it is you live in. You tap your way out to the street. You tap your way down to the gate where you know, unless somebody has taken you there, you're going to spend your whole day. And what are you going to do? You're going to sit there all day and beg for people to give you something because you can't get anything for yourself. There's no safety net in Palestine in the first century. If you were blind, If people didn't take care of you, you starved to death and died. Period. That was it. There's no safety net. You don't call up the DFACS and get some help sent your way. There is no DFACS. So he does what he has to do to survive that day. And for him, this is a typical day. He walks out and taps his way to the roadside, wherever he planted himself every day. Everybody knew to expect Bartimaeus to be sitting there waiting for whatever would be given to him. This is Jericho. If he were in Jerusalem, he'd gather right outside the temple because a lot of people would be going in and out of there. And of course, if you're going to go meet with God, you're probably going to be more generous than you would be if you're just on your way to work. So he goes out with the same expectation he already had, but he hears a crowd and he says, you know what? There's something going on. What's going on? He probably, how many times did he ask before somebody finally said, well, Jesus of Nazareth is coming with his entourage through town. Well, as soon as he hears it, he just starts calling out. And he doesn't say Jesus of Nazareth. He says Jesus, son of David. Because he knows there's something about Jesus that's true that nobody else in this crowd seemed to have any idea of. So his expectations are different now. You know what strikes me about this is, and I say this with reverence, but I say it to myself as much as I say it to anybody, we don't expect anything. We don't. We come to church, I do. I come here expecting to set up my surface and pull up my Sunday school and pull up my sermon. I expect to talk with you guys during Sunday school and interact a little bit. I expect for us to come and sing a song and pray for the needs and then sing a song and then have a sermon and then pray, sing a song and then pray and leave the room. That's what I expect. I expect to have nice conversations with different people like Al and I. Al was here before I got here this morning, and so we had a long conversation. We were able to talk for a long time. That whole clock thing. So we come here just expecting to sit through a service, don't we? I mean, I'm not asking anybody to answer the question. Just think. That's what we expect. Expect Nancy to get up, sit down, play, sit over here, get back up, sit down and play. Everything about it we expect to go back there and the Keurig machine's going to spit out the coffee that we want to drink, everything. And I just think it becomes... The only word I know to put to it is a neologism. You know what that means? That's a new word. Neologisms are new words. Churchianity, that's what we come to believe in, is churchianity. It's just the gathering. And here it is. And then if the gathering becomes too mundane, why, we think to ourselves, why should I even bother? And I think that's a legitimate question. I really do. So why do we come? Do we expect anything at all? I think we're not like Bartimaeus. I think that we're just not desperate enough for God to act. Because look out, if you look out the windows, you see the windshields glowing all over, the sun shining on vehicles. We've all got vehicles. We're going to go home. Our stomachs were full when we got here. We're going to go home and fill them up again. We're not concerned about that. I'm not. Are you? I'm not worried that when I open the refrigerator there's nothing in there. I'm not worried about having to be like Bartimaeus and go get out there on the roadside and tap my way to the roadside and wait for somebody to give me something. I'm not that desperate. I'm not desperate at all. As a matter of fact, not only do I have everything I need, I got a lot of stuff I want, additional to everything I need. So when I come to church, what am I here for? I'm doing what I guess I'm supposed to do, right? And that's how we look at it a lot. Life is good. So God, and I know He's listening to me, so I want to be careful. I don't want to drop dead here in front of everybody. But life is so good we don't need Him to do very much. That's just the honest truth. But you know, these things that we prayed about today, I want you to think for a moment if you were Jessica and Tristan was your son and he's got a brain tumor and you can't do anything about that brain tumor. That's desperate. That's desperate. You know, the only thing worse, if I look at Bartimaeus as the example, the only thing worse than being blind like Bartimaeus is to not know it. to think we really see. So what in our lives, I think it's a good question to ask. I don't say this, honest to goodness, and the Lord knows my heart. I don't say any of this so we'll feel guilty. Don't misunderstand me. I'm where you are. I'm nobody. So everything you're feeling right now as the words come out of my mouth, I feel. I feel the same. I look at my life, it's just like anybody else's. I'm not desperate. I'm not. So I think a good question for us to look at our own lives and ask is not to make us feel bad, but so that there's the more that walking with God should bring. What in our lives are we harboring that stops God from acting? What in our lives do we have in our lives that makes us come here and expect absolutely nothing except to sit through an hour on a Sunday morning? That's a good question, I think. And I'm going to ask us some further questions here. Do we do things that create a scenario of our lives such that God is excluded from our daily affairs? That's a good question. See, we look at this church. The church is separate. The gathering is separate. It's the only time when we have the corporate body of believers here in one spot. So that's different, and it should be different. But do you or I invite God to spend the mundane moments of living with us? I don't mean just think about Him. I mean actually invite God to come into those moments wherein maybe there's something we have to do that day that requires a certain competence level. Do we think that God knows about that? Is He competent to do what we do for a living or to do whatever it is we have to do that day? I would say He's the smartest person in the world. Why would I not want to invite Him alongside to give me the assistance? I'm not the smartest person in the world. I want you to think about good friends. This is another way of thinking about this. Everybody in this room's got good friends. I see some of my good friends today. Okay, when you're with a good friend, what is the most common activity? Talking, hanging out, right? It's not anything special. You know what the best friends are? The best friends are those with whom you can just sit and be. You don't have to do anything. You can go to a movie and stare at that glowing screen with your good friends and not say anything for 2.5, 3 hours. And it's purely the fact that the friend is there. That's what matters. Why do we think God is not like that? Why? Why do we think that God is not desirous to spend the stupid, common, elemental moments of our living with us only when we come here? But somehow that's when God spends that time. Isn't it amazing to you that God will encounter us in that way? I think it's amazing. I think it's amazing that God encounters me when I'm just like a little kid who's just busted the window and has to go be in trouble with the parent. And God just says, come on in. He doesn't wait for us to get cleaned up. He doesn't wait for us to get it right. He doesn't wait for the prayers to be beautiful. He doesn't wait for any of that. He wants you and me just because we're you and me. Man, what's the matter with us that we don't relish that? I don't know. Jesus was happy to answer this man's prayer. Happy. Think about Jesus, how cool it would be to find a blind person crying out to you like this, like a small child cries out to a parent, and to go to that child and be able to really do exactly what they're asking. Do you think he wasn't excited to do that? I tell you, this little story tells me everything I want to know about God's character. I don't know what it's going to take for me or any of us to have that expectation. I really don't know. I think that's probably why when Paul speaks about what heaven is like, he says, you don't know anything. No eye has seen, no ear has heard. It hasn't even entered into your minds what it is that God's prepared for those who love Him. On this day, He had prepared blind Bartimaeus to see. Man, I don't know where everybody is today, but if I've said anything that you've got a question about, pray with me, argue with me, whatever,